I suppose it's possible for any specialist to take for granted the essence of their work. While an expert is wrapped up in the specifics, the rest of us can only marvel. From surgeons to pilots, one person's daily grind is everyone else's miracle of science. But if composers forget the big picture of what it is to organise sound, composers within UK universities really cannot, at least not nowadays. Recently we've had to consider what the act of composing achieves before someone else decides it for us. This debate, which like most debate is ultimately a useful one, has been triggered by the regular research assessment undergone by all UK universities. For 20 years, composers submitted their works for this exercise alongside books and other stuff without quibble. Latterly though, a mist of pressure has stolen around us to explain just what is researchy about our compositions. Implicit in this is an element of doubt as to whether it fits the bill as research. Apparently it might, or it might not. Also implicit is that this actually matters. It's hard to pinpoint where this pressure's come from. It's not a straightforward imposition by the actual research audit itself. Actually, it seems to be driven mostly from within the ranks of composers themselves. So it is that composition of music, which by definition preceded writing about music and was itself the mainstay of music study in the pre-20th century university, is now forced to explain itself in research terms. And that despite constituting over 30% of what universities now submit to that research audit within music. It does feel like we face a stiff interview before we can join the dinner table, though we have to stump up as much as anyone once the bill arrives. So why is the essence of composition under the spotlight? Things have come to a head over the issue of putting what we do into words. In 2008, the exercise that audits research in the UK's universities allowed submitted musical works to be accompanied by a short statement. This was to make explicit what the composer regarded as the research elements. It wasn't compulsory, but nearly everyone went along with it. Many of us, though, viewed it coldly, firstly as the thin end of a likely wedge, and secondly because of its implication that our compositions alone might not now be sufficient. Those optional 300 words in fact posed a question not intended by their originators. Is music that can explicate research content now thought better than other music? And in concrete terms, will a work claiming explicit research aspects score in this audit over a work that may be of more durable artistic worth, but is not a spearhead for a particular innovation? Or over a work that doesn't submit a statement at all? Such official answers as we have to these questions have been contradictory. The fear is that innovation has come to be privileged over the synthesis that is at the heart of composing music. As a composer, you're controlling many things at once, and these may produce highly individual art without being new in themselves as elements. But once you're invited to summarize innovatory elements, the strong implication is, of course, that they are the important content. And the idea that a work of art is about such research elements is highly misleading. What's more, it disadvantages, say, a more traditional work whose expression uses no progressive tools but is still powerful, or just music that is not conceived in terms of specific researches. By this token, an early 20th century audit would have scored, say, Hindemith or George Antheil above Puccini or Janacek or certainly Rachmaninoff. 30 years earlier, Erik Satie's music might rate more importance than Brahms. The innovators opened new means and modes of expression, certainly, but the traditionalists speak eternal and individual artistic truths to the listener, as we know, if in less quantifiable ways. In a mid-18th century audit, for example, there's no doubt that points for innovation would have gone to the new Italianate Sinfonia of composers like Wagenseil or Mon, rather than the traditional Kapellmeister J.S. Bach, who plugged away within tired old forms by the standards of the day. So you can see that big questions are now in play, and they surfaced as soon as those short statements were elicited from university composers. The wedge that appears between innovation-led compositions and those apparently not so is a major issue once we assess new music with the help of research statements. It clearly illustrates the distorting effect of supporting argument. For starters, it admits an element of cynicism that is entirely alien to good composition and indeed good research itself. Composers are being invited to point up elements which may or may not be really important in the artistic result. So here's a new fissure opening up. The experimental element that I wheel out in my statement may be of little significance in my actual music. It fits the bill as a talking point, but in art, the newness of a material is only one facet of its communicative power, raising the possibility that research is not the word for what we do. Value or achievement might be more neutral terms that we need. It's not hard to think of recent music that triumphantly amounts to more than its workings. Arvo Pärt's Cantus in Memory of Britain, for example, can be deconstructed to little more than a canon in augmentation of a falling Aeolian scale. But its heady expressive power reaches numerous listeners who care little for canons and Aeolian scales and so forth. To assess such an artifact in terms of its functioning elements is like assessing Hamlet by examining all the speeches of Hamlet at once, then all the speeches of Ophelia, then Gertrude, and so on. It assesses the parts, but no longer the whole. I wanted to avoid saying it's pulling the wings off a butterfly, but that's about the size of it. For this reason, it's necessary to dig more deeply, to examine the extent to which we are actually researchers when we compose. No two composers will agree about this, and it's important that they don't have to. If our processes are not fully comparable, then either we need a permissive environment that accepts the autonomy of music, or we need a separate exercise. For me, there are important ways in which composition is not research in any broad understanding of that term, but this is purely my own standpoint. I've already pointed to the swamp that awaits anyone making a glib assumption that all composition is research, a bland assertion that you do hear with distressing frequency in UK universities. So let me try for some definitions of big ideas. Let's start with research and creativity, both of them terms bandied about a lot. Well, the shorter Oxford English Dictionary suggests that research is a course of critical or scientific inquiry. Composition certainly involves critical judgment, but the values of science are much more problematic for art, or it wouldn't be art. That pitfall I cited just now, the showcasing of researchy items that may actually be more incidental, is really more of a chasm. It represents the confusion of art and science, or rather the confusion of judging art by the criteria of science. The goals of scientific research and art are quite different, or can be, and we confuse these at our peril. The goal of most art is surely communication, even eloquence, at some level. This is achieved by new materials in many cases, but at the same time, familiar vocabulary is also a factor. It's hard to reach an audience with a speech in a language that no one understands. So art is more likely to draw at once on a complex mixture of the recognized and the unfamiliar, welded into an entity, a quite different dimension of achievement from research. For research to be valuable, whether in science or in art itself, innovation and discovery is surely central, whether it be a cure for disease or an insight into Shakespeare. So let's follow instead the term discovery, which is quite revealing. I've made a discovery. The Eureka claim by a researcher announces the output itself. It's the goal of the research, whether you found it in a manuscript or a protein. I've made a discovery, as uttered by an artist, though, announces something that might be useful toward the end product, or might be fun along the way, or might be useless. It's not the thing itself. What about creativity, meanwhile? I've always described the creative act as the making of something that wasn't there before, using materials that were there before. The latter bit, the refashioning of familiar vocabulary that I mentioned, is surely central. But there's another dimension to creative work that removes it from the idea of independent research. It's not a line, but a field. A piece of music is not so much a linear series of processes as an expanding field of interactions, controlled by the composer, in which local and broader contexts are hard to disentangle. Unlike a premise to be evaluated, the composition works at multiple levels simultaneously. As a master of time control, or so we hope, the composer is managing interactions all at once across a few seconds, a few minutes, and a quarter of an hour, or more. It's a game of three-dimensional chess. Perhaps Hermann Hesse saw this more clearly than most when making a special link between composition and his imagined glass bead game. This is not to make special pleading for composers, but to mark important qualitative differences. For example, sporting excellence and music performance can overlap, yet huge differences also separate their goals. And in the same way, The myriad decisions that put together a musical work do not map neatly onto what the world understands as research, however convenient an alignment would be for bureaucratic purposes. Maybe classical composing is a sort of researching. After all, new modes of expression are certainly central, but calling this research can be highly misleading to the academic world at large if it thinks this also speaks about artistic ranking. It also varies from one composer to another. For me, preliminary sources, researches, are something that precedes some works, not the composing that actually uses them. Yet for other composers, there's other practice which they feel is a research, not I. The result of this is an uncomfortable debate about what is the fair assessment of our work. Even if it is accepted that we don't all want to submit words to explain our qualities according to someone else's rules, the fear is now airborne that those who do not are placing their work at a disadvantage. Our universities and colleges, also fearful of this, may strong-arm their composers into playing the game accordingly. How else, they ask, can music and dance or theatre or whatever then be weighed and compared, like the ton of lead and the ton of feathers in the schoolboy riddle? And this is called fairness. Only in a Lewis Carroll world could it be said to be fair to compel new music to undergo this reassignment process, regardless of the composer's identity and beliefs. So are there criteria with which to judge new music? Absolutely. For me, they relate to expressive dimensions of individuality, durability and authenticity. Elusive concepts unlikely to be adopted by a committee and for which experience alone can hone the receptors. Yet anyone setting themselves up to assess new art should possess those receptors to arrive at an informed, if inevitably subjective view, for this is art. No one without that competence should have the shortcut of a user's manual as if these were A-level set works. When we take the long view of music, the salient features of great art are often those of interaction with wider historical context. We look back to Monteverdi or Schoenberg, not for their desiccated research outcomes, catalogued like cogs and bolts in a workshop, but for their overall mediation of their given historical backgrounds. The specific machine parts of their responses would matter little if once removed from the all-important overall assembly. Finally, we may ask what it is that supporting text about music has going for it, given its distorting and divisive effects. Quite simply, some composers have a completely legitimate desire to get out aspects of work of which they are proud, and this is their right to get them out in words or text. At a darker level, I fear it is a product of our bureaucratized and commodified society. Education mechanisms want to compare like with like and are happy to squish art into whatever boxes conveniently facilitate a metrical process with other disciplines. But music is perennially awkward to the system, maddeningly wordless and indeed sublimely useless. Refusing to speak up for its own achievements, it is mute, and new music is more inscrutable than the rest, and that's its perfect right. So, daunted by the subjective swamp of real artistic judgment, the processes of regimentation in our higher education may welcome any levelling tools that keep the wheels of endless comparison turning. We can end by asking why composition is being judged by research canons at all. Who dreamed up these distinctions and imposed them on everybody? The only purpose of any worthwhile audit is to evaluate the fitness of work, any work, for its designated purpose, and new music should have to satisfy only the canons proper to its function as art. That may or may not involve research, depending on the composer. Those whose composition adds to bodies of research in, say, acoustics, or use of folk musics or spatial deployment should be free to put those properties forward. But work that ticks those boxes cannot be taken for that as being better than art less obviously concerned with specific properties. The way art works is nothing like as straightforward as that, however much the state's management of institutions would need it to be. Sorry.